This training is on how to use the NRCS Pacific Islands Area Biology Technical Note 18 Threatened, Endangered, and Candidate Species Compliance Process. Biology Technical Note 18 is used to comply with the Pacific Islands Area NRCS Threatened and Endangered Species Policy and the Endangered Species Act. This includes compliance with the policy on candidate species. The technical note can be found on the Pacific Islands Area webpage under Technical Resources, Pacific Islands Area Technical Notes page, Biology. The technical note itself is an Adobe Acrobat file that covers the compliance process in detail. There are 5 attachments that go with the technical note, and this training will review each of those. The technical note starts with an overview of the policy that requires NRCS to evaluate the effects of our actions on federally listed species, species proposed for federal listing, federal candidate species, designated and proposed critical habitat, and state and tribal species of concern. Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act requires us as a federal agency to conduct a thorough analysis of effects of our actions on listed and proposed threatened and endangered species and proposed and designated critical habitat. Conservation practices that are not funded by NRCS are not subject to the Endangered Species Act Section 7 compliance, but they do need to be reviewed and comply with our ESA policy as described in the technical note and in the general manual. When it comes to the Endangered Species Act, conservation practices are plans that are implemented by our clients using funding from us or any actions under our control, compatible use authorizations for wetland reserve program easements, for example, need to be evaluated under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. Compliance with our policy should all be documented on the PIA NRCS CPA 52 and Attachment A of Biology Technical Note 18. The compliance process includes doing a species inventory, identifying the potential effects of the proposed actions, making a determination of those effects, and completing the documentation per policy requirements. There are 3 effect determinations if species or their habitat are present in the action area. No effect, may affect but not likely to adversely affect, and may affect and may adversely affect. No effect is self-explanatory. A not likely to adversely affect, or NLAA determination, results in an informal consultation that requires a letter to be sent to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service for concurrence on that determination. An adverse effect requires a formal consultation with either of those 2 agencies. Let's go over the steps to make a determination. The first step is to complete a species inventory and critical habitat review. This is comprised of an off-site inventory and an on-site inventory. The off-site inventory is what is done in the office using the GIS shapefiles and all the information that is available on the rare species associated with that site. This off-site inventory results in a candidate, threatened, endangered, proposed endangered species, and critical habitat map, and the associated data table if that's needed. These maps can be made using Toolkit and the appropriate data sets, and we have Biology Technical Note 13 to guide you in making those maps. When doing an off-site inventory, keep in mind that for animals, since they are mobile, they are considered possibly present in the action area if they are on a map of the action area at a 1 to 24,000 resolution. Both current and historical sightings need to be considered in determining an animal's possible presence. Plants are considered possibly present in the action area if there is a point or polygon that is in a 1/3 mile buffer zone around the action area and are current. Current means they have been recorded from the area in the last 20 years. Critical habitat is considered present if it overlaps the action area. It is either in or out of the action area based on the map. The on-site inventory takes place when you go and visit the field. It is helpful to take data gathered during the off-site visit process with you in the field as an indicator of what to look for. The on-site inventory can incorporate observations made directly by you, the planner, as well as information obtained from the client. Planners are free to request information from local experts, including other conservation partners. Species that do not appear on the off-site inventory may be observed during the site visit or noted by other sources. These should be documented as being present in or near the action area. The planner should also assess the presence or absence of suitable habitat for any of the candidate, threatened, endangered, proposed threatened, or proposed endangered species possibly present in the action area. For example, if the off-site inventory shows water birds on the map, wetlands or water bodies are possibly suitable habitat. If bats are shown on the map, then the trees of a certain type may be considered suitable habitat. Suitable habitat will depend on the list of possible species present and their habitat needs. The Action Area in Cultural Resources Compliance is known as the APE, or Area of Potential Effects. For the Endangered Species Act, it is just called Action Area. The action area needs to be defined. When considering the action area, consider both direct effects and indirect effects. Direct effects are right on site and immediate to the action. Indirect effects are those that may be off-site or might result later in time, but are still reasonably certain to occur. There is a graphic in the technical note that shows you how to define an action area. In this case, the action area is a combination of the indirect effects of the action and the direct effects of the action. These two combined become the action area. So, for example, if somebody is cutting down trees to use as fence posts, and NRCS is paying for that fence, and they are collecting those fence posts on their own and not buying them from a dealer, then the action area is not just where the fence is being built, but also where those trees are being harvested. Another example may be structural practices. The action area includes not only the footprint of the finished structure, but also any staging areas for equipment and supplies, as well as access routes to and from the construction site. You then need to determine the potential effects. These need to be direct effects, indirect effects, long-term and short-term effects of all the proposed conservation practices included in the project. Effects need to be determined for critical habitat and/or the species of concern. So, if, for example, let's say you have a conservation plan that includes micro-irrigation, conservation crop rotation, cover crop, tree shrub site preparation, and windbreak shelter belt installation. Whatever it takes to prepare for and install those practices, what, when, where, and how, including all people and machinery, is considered the action. A determination needs to take into consideration how all those actions, taken together, may be affecting either the species or habitat identified for any of the species potentially in the action area, and to any proposed or designated critical habitat. Any determination made needs to be reasonable, defendable, and documented in Attachment A and on the CPA 52. I will be covering Attachment A in more detail later in the training. Any no-effect determination must be reviewed by the responsible federal official, usually the DC, and concurred with. Signature lines are available in Attachment A to document that concurrence. For those practices or actions that may affect listed threatened or endangered species or designated critical habitat, but not adversely affect them, an NLAA informal consultation needs to be completed. Attachments B and D are template letters for either U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. Drafted letters are initially reviewed by the DC or other RFO and sent to the state office, me, for further review. Once the not likely to adversely affect letter is deemed ready to be sent to the other agency, I will process that for signature and mailing. An electronic copy of the letter will be sent to the planner, DC, and ARC. When a response is received from one of the other agencies, an electronic version of that response letter will be sent to the planner for inclusion in the conservation plan file. If a response is not received from one of the agencies within 45 days from the day the letter was signed, the planner may contact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service to find out if a response letter is forthcoming. Keep in mind we must receive a comment from the agency that they concur or don't concur with our determination. The CPA 52 cannot be updated or signed, and work on the proposed actions cannot be started until the concurrence letters are received from either of the two agencies. If a non-concurrence letter is received, then I will advise on how to proceed. A tracking system should be in place to make sure that actions controlled by NRCS don't occur until all the ESA documentation determinations and concurrences are completed and documented. A tracking tool may be provided by the appropriate area office or the state office. Also, note that candidate species are not covered by ESA Section 7, but NRCS policy requires that we let the client know if any adverse effects to candidate species may happen. Also by policy, NRCS needs to implement avoidance measures to minimize or eliminate any adverse effects, if possible. The reason there are two different template letters for the not likely to adversely affect is that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service have different requirements both in formatting and information. So the appropriate template letter should be used for the appropriate agency. The very last page of Biology Technical Note 18 is a flow chart that summarizes the process we just talked about. So let's take a look at Attachment A. Attachment A is now an Adobe Acrobat fillable form. It used to be an Excel spreadsheet, but that has changed because of the new protocols. As a fillable form in Adobe Acrobat, there are limits to how much text can be entered in each cell, so keep that in mind when filling this out. There is also a Clear Form button up in the upper left-hand corner. Attachment A starts with a checklist to prepare you for doing the compliance documentation, here under Preparation. The first question asks if a map has been created. This is the off-site inventory mentioned earlier. If you answer no, there is a note that tells you to make a map before you go to the next section. The second question is whether or not an on-site inventory has been completed. This is a document of the presence or absence of T, E, or C species, including information from the client, the planner, neighbors, and/or local experts. Again, if you say no, there's a note telling you to conduct that inventory and document the results. If you say yes, there's a space for you to say where that documentation can be found. Question 3 asks if an on-site inventory has been completed of the vegetation and other features that may be suitable habitat for any threatened, endangered, or candidate species. Remember that you're looking not only for the presence or absence of listed species or critical habitat, you are also looking for the presence or absence of habitat suitable for the species that may be in the area, as indicated by the off-site inventory. For example, suitable habitat might include wetlands, open water, foraging habitat, host plants for insects, suitable trees or shrubs or other vegetation for nesting, etc. If you answer no, there is a note to go back and do an inventory and document those results. If you answer yes, you need to note where that information is available. Question 4 asks whether or not this was done by an NRCS employee. If a non-NRCS employee has done these inventories, then it needs to be confirmed by an NRCS employee that the information is accurate and they concur. Question 5 has to do with whether or not this is a farm bill authorization or other financial assistance, or has to do with a compatible use authorization. If the answer is no, then the compliance documentation is completed in the CPA 52 Endangered and Threatened Species Guide Sheet, and there is no need to complete the rest of this attachment. Complete the CPA 52 as directed under those guidelines. No to question 5 means CTA plans. If you answer yes to question 5, then that means this review is for a funded contract or a contract that is highly likely to be funded. There is a reminder here to enter the application or contract number at the top of the page. So this preparation checklist can be used for CTA plans as well as for financial assistance or compatible use authorization types of plans, but really the place to record decisions regarding CTA plans is the CPA 52 by using the guide sheet that is a worksheet of the CPA 52. This compliance documentation, Attachment A, is for those practices that are funded or controlled by NRCS. Question 6 has to do with the release form being signed by the client that allows us to do consultations with other agencies. If this has not been signed or the client refuses to sign this, then you need to stop the planning process as well as the documentation process for all areas that may be affecting endangered species or critical habitat. If they have signed the permission form, then proceed to the next question. The last question in the preparation stage has to do with whether or not the proposed actions have been described, stating what will happen, where it will happen, when it will happen, and how it will happen. This information is usually in job sheets or engineering designs or a description in the CPA 52 or plan maps or a combination of all of these things. If that information is available and adequately described, then mark yes and say where that information is available. So the above section lets you know that you are prepared to do the determination work to comply with NRCS policy. The next section, the screening questions, helps you make your determinations and document them. The first screening question has to do with critical habitat. You need to note here if there is any designated or proposed critical habitat in the action area, or whether or not the project will affect any designated or proposed critical habitat near the project area as a result of indirect effects. You mark yes or no. How you answer each of these questions indicate what other parts of Attachment A needs to be completed. The second question has to do with suitable habitat. This is different from designated or proposed critical habitat. It is habitat suitable for threatened, endangered, or candidate species currently or historically known from the area. If the answer is yes, there is suitable habitat, keep in mind that you need to fill out the determination documentation below for the appropriate category of species, C, T, or E. The third question is whether the action area has any candidate species, either indicated on the map or data table, or were documented in the on-site inventory. Remember the distinction between animals and plants as far as presence or absence goes. The fourth question has to do with the presence or absence of listed threatened or endangered species, and the fifth question has to do with the presence or absence of proposed threatened or endangered species. If you answered no to questions 1 through 5, then you're done after you document not applicable on the CPA 52. If you answer yes for any of the questions 1 through 5, then you need to complete the appropriate section below. That is, for each of the yes answers, you would complete the section below for that answer. So for critical habitat, there are questions to decide if there is an effect or not. The first question asks if any of the proposed actions affect anything listed as primary constituent elements of critical habitat. If the answer is no, then you're done with the critical habitat portion and you just document no effect on the CPA 52 for critical habitat and give your reasoning here. This is a documentation of why you are saying no. If you answer yes, you need to go on to the next questions asking if the effects can be minimized so that you're not adversely modifying critical habitat. If you say no here, that means there will be an adverse modification of critical habitat due to NRCS controlled actions. The result is the need for a formal consultation with the appropriate agency. The directions tell you to have the RFO contact me, the state biologist, to initiate the consultation and to say may affect in the CPA 52 and mark the check if needs further action box in the CPA 52. It also tells you to reference this document in the CPA 52. If you answer yes, the action can be modified to minimize or avoid adverse effects to critical habitat. Then the directions tell you to draft a NLAA letter for review by the RFO and the state biologist. If you draft a NLAA letter, the instructions go on to tell you how to complete the CPA 52. The next section has to do with whether you answered yes to question 2 and/or 3 in the screening questions and is the first of the 3 species categories, candidate species. Remember, there was a question having to do with suitable habitat for possible rare species, question 2, in the screening questions. Screening question 3 has to do with candidate species. If you answer no, that the proposed action will not affect candidate species or their habitat, then you fill in your reasoning, say why, and you mark no effect on the CPA 52 and reference this document. Remember that this is a fillable form in Adobe Acrobat format, so you have a limited amount of space to give your reasoning, so keep it succinct but complete. If you say yes, the proposed activities may affect the candidate species or their habitat, you need to proceed to the next question. Then you ask yourself, are those effects of the proposed actions wholly beneficial in both the short and long term? If you say no, you need to proceed to the next question. If you say yes, you give the reason why there will be beneficial effects and document may affect on the CPA 52 and use this document as a reference, but no further action is needed. There is an effect, it just happens to be wholly beneficial. If you answered no above, you need to ask yourself if the proposed actions will negatively affect the candidate species or their habitat. If you say no, you give your reasoning below and document no effect on the CPA 52 and reference this document. If you say yes, then you have to recommend alternative treatments that would avoid or minimize those adverse effects as much as possible and provide long-term benefits to the species. You describe those avoidance measures below and mark may affect on the CPA 52 and reference this document. But again, no further action is needed because consultation with another agency is not required. By policy, NRCS is responsible for documenting how we're avoiding harming candidate species. Make sure those avoidance measures are incorporated into any job sheet and are communicated to the client. The next section is about listed threatened and endangered species, where you answered yes for the screening questions 2 and 4, suitable habitat and listed species. The first question asks if the proposed actions will affect listed threatened or endangered species or their habitat. If the off-site inventory, CT and E species map, indicates there may be certain animal species in the area, you need to make sure the proposed action will also have no effect on their habitat, if it exists in the project area. Suitable habitat may or may not be native habitat. Many of our listed species use non-native vegetation for parts of their life cycle, or habitat may be abiotic features, such as streams or wetlands. If you say no to the proposed actions affecting the habitat or the listed species, then you say why below by being succinct but complete, and you mark no effect on the CPA 52 and reference this document. If you say yes, though, you need to go to the next question. The next question asks if the effects are wholly beneficial or minimized to the point of being insignificant or discountable. If you say no, that steps you up to a formal consultation and you need to mark may affect on the CPA 52 and put a checkbox in the check if needs further action box and reference this document. This document should continue to be used to record what's going on with that formal consultation. When it was initiated, when it was finalized, then a summary of any parameters that are outlined in the formal consultation, usually avoidance measures, needs to be recorded here. But hopefully you'll be able to say yes, that you can minimize the effects to get down to insignificant or discountable, or wholly beneficial. For example, you might say that the client will not cut down or manipulate a certain type of tree known as roosting or nesting habitat of a listed bat or bird. By marking yes, you need to prepare a draft not likely to adversely affect letter for review, first by the RFO and then by me for submission to the appropriate agency. You need to mark may affect in the CPA 52 and check the box that says check if needs further action and reference this document. Again, this document will be used to track that letter, when the consultation was initiated, the date the letter was sent out, and the date the consultation was finalized, when the letter was received back from the agency. You also need to summarize the parameters of the informal consultation, usually avoidance measures, after you get the letter back. This process is exactly the same for proposed, threatened, or endangered species if you'd answered yes for screening questions 2 and/or 5. The process is the same for proposed listed species, except it's called a conference as opposed to a consultation. The reason we keep these two separate is that if the proposed species become finally listed species during the life of the contract, we should really confirm in our records or with the other agency that the determination remains the same. The planner must sign this document and forward to the responsible federal official for approval. It needs to be signed by an NRCS employee. We cannot have outside agency people making our determinations for us, so determinations recorded in this paperwork need to be that of a NRCS employee. Because this is in Adobe Acrobat file format, an electronic signature is appropriate, and there is a place where that can be inserted. The responsible federal official must review this document and sign it if it is complete and accurate. The signature confirms that this documentation is accurate and complete and is in compliance with NRCS policy and the Endangered Species Act Section 7 requirements. Again, the RFO is usually the DC for the field office where this contract is being managed. If you do have to draft a not likely to adversely affect letter to either U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service, we have template letters for you. Attachment B is a Microsoft Word document for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Attachment D is for NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. As a reminder, they're slightly different in format and content. Just use the appropriate letter and fill out with all the appropriate information. These letters are first reviewed by the responsible federal official to make sure it is written to their standards and then forwarded to me for review. When it's ready to be mailed out, it will be processed in the state office since it's signed by the director and goes to the head of another agency. An electronic copy will be sent to the planner, to their DC if the DC is not the planner, to the area resource conservationist, and to the manager of the program the contract is under. When a response letter is received by the state office, an electronic copy will be sent to those same people. It is up to the field office to record the dates the letter was sent and the response letter was received using attachment A as discussed earlier. It is also the responsibility of the field office to summarize any avoidance measures mentioned in the response letter and to make sure the appropriate job sheets reflect those avoidance measures. Also, the client needs to be made aware that they cannot start any of the contracted practices until a concurrence is received from the other agency and must follow all avoidance measures laid out in order to have a practice certified by NRCS as completed correctly. The state or area office may provide a tracking tool for field offices to assure that ESA and other NEPA compliance is completed and followed. If you have any questions about this or anything related to Endangered Species Act compliance or NRCS policy regarding rare species, feel free to contact your area office. If they are unable to help you, they may ask me for assistance or have you contact me directly.